turn. So they've done all of those things, right? The only new thing probably at this point is going to be the landing. So why is it so difficult then? Why do students struggle so much with this whole lesson? What's your opinion?
Because you're putting everything together, and if you're not familiar with doing certain parts, then it's hard to put it together.
Correct. We're condensing it all into about a 6-minute maneuver, right? It takes approx 6 minutes, if that, in a DA40 to actually do this. The aircraft climbs at a fast rate, so you don't have much time to actually do all of these things. Students are slow, they take ages to get the aeroplane leveled off or complete a turn. All the while you're saying, we need to go down, we've just climbed above circuit altitude, or we need to go that way, because we're about to fly out of the control zone. It's busy. Information processing is really high, so I talk about that in this briefing as well. This is just to highlight what it actually looks like. I don't give too much information on that slide. This is an important one to expand a bit on. I'll talk about exactly what to expand on when I present it. You're coming back to give way rules again. So some of these you may have discussed out of necessity on previous flights. Otherwise, some may have been discussed during the taxi lesson. Should be questions here, because by now you will have taught the student how to do run-ups and pre-takeoff checks and why they're done, so you could ask questions around why do we actually do these checks. We'll cover that in this briefing for you guys. What else have we got down there? Yeah, that should be stuff you've already talked to them about as well. It's a bit of a sidetrack, a side point as you go through this. The ear exercise is kind of built all the way through this briefing. We're not going to get to the end and actually have an ear exercise. So it's built all the way along with a few tangents like why we use flap on takeoff and judging runway perspective, for example. Some of this stuff they will already know, so potential questions here. Again, potential questions. I think it's this slide, we have a video, so you could talk through the lineup checks. You can't hear the instructor talking in the background, but you can say what they'd actually be doing. Talk through the takeoff, and this video stops just as they start the crosswind turn. So I just talk through this whole thing, so they've got an idea of how fast you're having to do things. A tangent on swing on takeoff. Obviously, you know there are more factors than just these two that cause swing on takeoff. We don't need to tell them all of those things. These are the two that are consistently relevant to a DA40, right? So these are the two we're going to focus on. We're not going to talk about crosswinds because this is intro to circuits where we would not be doing that on a day where there is a crosswind. This should just be relatively revision based. This should be revision based. This is just to recap on what you talked about so far. Potentially talk a little bit more here. What have we got here? Or maybe this is the video. It's either, yeah, here we are, this is the video. A couple of photos just to show the perspective of the turn, show what that 45-degree angle should look like. The next couple of photos are about how to, or what the ideal spacing should actually look like. I talk a little bit more around what to do in the event that the spacing is incorrect. I like to relate the spacing to an angle as well. So if we look at the ideal spacing, this one here, there's a certain angle between your seat and the aircraft and the runway. That's the correct angle, whereas when we look at this one, note how the angle gets steeper, suggesting that we're too close, and then the next one is going to be the opposite. The angle now is shallower, suggesting we're too far away. So the reason I talk about angles here is because what is profile? Profile is an angle. We use an angle all the way down to the touchdown point to actually judge that you're on profile, and that assessment begins back here in the downwind leg. With the downwind legs, you're really just highlighting that there's a lot to do. It may be the longest distance leg, but it also goes very quickly because you're faster. There's a bit of discussion on drift. We have to discuss drift because you're not likely to get a perfectly calm, still day, so there will usually be a requirement to talk about wind. When you refer to these checks here, make sure you do call them pre-landing checks. Plenty of instructors out there call them downwind checks. Not good, because as soon as the student isn't joining downwind, they will forget to do them because they've associated with downwind. They are pre-landing checks. The base turn slides, you see there's a lot of information on them. You're just highlighting that the base turn, when you do it, depends on many different variables. Everything on this slide and probably more. We don't need to go through and discuss them all. We're just going to discuss in a little bit of detail the one in yellow. It's just to highlight that no two circuits are the same and they have to adapt to the different variables and conditions. This here on the base turn slide, I think it says 500 feet per minute there. We're not thinking of 500 feet per minute as a target. It's more of just a reference. Like if we were to look at the vertical speed indicator and to see 1,000 RPM on there, so 1,000 feet per minute, we're thinking, right, there's something's unusual here. Something's not right. What's going on? Is the nose attitude too low? Is the power setting correct? Have we not trimmed the aeroplane? That's all that's about. It's not a target. Stand by as this thing sorts itself out. So the reason why I talk about angle back at the downwind slides is relevant here, because on the base leg, the angle between the aircraft and the aiming point is the best way to judge if you are on profile or not. You can't use the aiming point in the wind screen, its position, because you're not on final. Runway perspective in terms of is the runway long, short, wide or narrow doesn't work because you're viewing the runway at an angle. The parpy lights aren't visible. So really it's the only way to judge whether or not you are on profile is the angle between you and the aiming point. So there's a couple of slides on that showing the differences, and spend some time actually describing what that angle looks like. Like when it's shallow, we're looking more across at the aiming point. Things arise up into our peripheral vision. When we're high, we're looking more down onto the aiming point. The angle is steeper. These are no longer called final checks, they're called landing checks. That's a change we made in the SOPs late last year, so I just need to go back and use the wording, but always landing checks. It runs through all the different ways of judging profile. It's probably in the thick room, there's a wooden runway that looks a bit like one of these, so you can use that as a tool, but I don't think it's necessary because it's all on the slides here. But this stuff is, honestly, it's a bit ridiculous because unless you are ridiculously high or ridiculously low, the runways don't tend to change like this, and you'd never want it to get ridiculous. Like you would hopefully have noticed before it got to that stage that we need to do something and sort it out then. Still run through it, because it is important that they have that tool up their sleeve, but honestly it's like I never even use that one. And then when you go to fielding where the runway is skinnier, it's an illusion. It makes you look like you're high. So it's not really reliable. Then there's an aiming point movement one, and the parpy lights. talking about here the need to adjust the power setting once you actually get back onto profile, so that we're not chasing it all the way down. And then the new stuff, the landing. You probably need to give a little bit more detail on the landing than just what is on the slide. So you're talking about, how do I even judge what height to start rounding out? We don't want them looking at the altimeter, that'd be the worst thing to do when we're 20 feet above the runway. But how do we even judge what 20 feet or 10 feet looks like? How do you?
To the end of the runway and breaking away.
Yeah, so you're using a peripheral, exactly. So you've got to teach them, well, what should the runway actually look like around them? What do all the objects actually look like? How big should they be? As they're focusing that way, what does everything look like out here? How do you then judge also if you're maintaining that altitude? You know, we don't want to see the runway moving down away from us. We don't want to see it rushing up on us. So you need to give a little bit of detail like that as well. It's not just what is on the slide. Particularly important because remember, this is the new thing. This is what they haven't done so far, is landing. Then there's just general revision things here. And it finishes on slide 49. So probably have a break. Yeah, somewhere downwind, I think it's approximately halfway, thereabouts, one of the downwind slides. Everyone's got a copy of the briefing, eh? Cool. So today we are looking at circuits. We're combining everything that you have learned so far. So we're talking about effects and controls, ancillary controls, straight level, climbing and descending turns, and the takeoff as well. And we're bringing that into one pattern being flown around the pattern, one sort of 6-minute rectangular pattern being flown around the airport, around the runway that we are using today. Today we are going to discuss the standard circuit, also the ideal circuit. We will talk more in the next briefing around what non-standard circuits are and some of the considerations that we may have to deal with in the flying environment. Hey Ross.
Oh, sorry to interrupt.
That's all good.
What time are you finishing at?
Probably hour, maximum hour and a half, yeah. Then,
I'll
yeah.
pick your brain for about 10 minutes after.
Yeah, sure.
Afterwards.
I'll come find you.
Cool.
Yeah, this will probably take us about an hour and a half, I would say.
Circuit, so
Yeah.
show off your circuit.
Oh yeah, it was me, wasn't it?
Yep.
Famous. Person in the video, yeah, Ross and I did the video for this. Forgot about that. This briefing will take us about an hour and a half and we'll have a break, about halfway through. This is just one and probably 5 or 6 separate circuit lessons that we're going to look at, introducing you to different concepts on your journey to first solo and consolidation training. Here are our objectives: to take off and follow the published procedures that conform to the aerodrome traffic circuit, avoiding conflict with other aircraft. So published procedures, what we're really referring to there is what is documented in the AIP. Now we've had a bit of a chat about the AIP before, and there's lots of information we can get about aerodrome operations, including circuit operations, departing and joining in that document. So we're going to become more familiar with those procedures as part of this lesson. And we always want to avoid conflict with other aircraft. To carry out an approach and landing using the most suitable runway. So the only real new thing for you today is the landing itself. I've taught you how to do all these other things individually out in the training area across multiple flights. Today we're just bringing it all together into a condensed pattern around the active runway. So what is the circuit? It's a rectangular pattern about the active runway. So the active runway is just whatever runway we are using today for our takeoff and landing. At its highest point, it is flown at usually 1,000 feet above ground level, but this does vary. For example, here in Palmerston North, it's actually 950 feet AGL. In Fielding, it's 900 feet AGL. In Foxpine and Paraparaumu, it is 1,000 feet AGL. So we can actually confirm that in the AIP as well, which we'll discuss at the end of this briefing. It is important to confirm it and not just assume that it is 1,000 feet AGL. Standard circuits are left-hand. We will talk about non-standard right-hand circuits in a future briefing. But we can also find this information in the AIP as well. This is what a circuit looks like. So there's multiple different legs. Let's imagine that we are taking off from runway 07 today, facing the ranges. Initial part is the takeoff, then we're going to climb on the upwind leg into wind. Then we make a turn ideally at 500 feet AGL onto the crosswind leg, and usually either on the crosswind leg or very early on the next leg, we're going to level off at the circuit altitude. And this youngest leg here is called the downwind leg, because the wind is coming from behind us. Even though it is the longest leg in terms of distance, it still goes pretty quickly, because at this point the aeroplane is traveling very fast. Somewhere on the downwind leg, we start to set up for the approach, and the aeroplane will be entered into a descent, and then we make a continuous descent down onto the base leg and on the final leg. And ideally we're turning onto final at 500 feet AGL before arriving at the runway for the landing. So it's very busy. It condenses everything into approximately 6 minutes. The circuit pattern is beneficial for a number of reasons. For safety and efficiency, it's a way of organising the flow of traffic at an airport. Airports are pretty busy places. Everyone heads towards them to land or they depart from them. So it's nice to know that there are a set of standard procedures that organises everyone and helps to keep us separated. A circuit pattern makes our position predictable to other pilots and also makes their position predictable for us. So it's much easier to see and avoid those conflicts we mentioned in the objectives. Circuits are a useful way of also organising aircraft that are arriving and departing from the aerodrome as well, so that we can be assured when we hear a radio call from a pilot saying that they are doing a particular procedure, we know exactly where to look for them and we know what they're doing, and we can assess whether or not they are a conflict to us with ease. We will deal with departing and joining in a separate briefing. Back in taxiing, we talked about some give way rules, specifically for on the ground, but there's lots of give way rules we have to be aware of when we're flying as well. Now, we've introduced a few of those over the last 10 lessons or so, and there's a few more we'll talk about today. Firstly, aircraft landing had right of way over aircraft taking off. Now, this is something we have talked about before. We never enter the runway if another aeroplane is landing. We always make sure we have a thorough lookout before we enter the runway. In the case of this aerodrome, we need permission from ATC as well. But in an uncontrolled aerodrome, such as Foxpine or Fielding, it's up to us to make sure the area is fully clear and that we have sufficient time before another aeroplane might land behind us. Aircraft that are already established in the circuit have right of way over aeroplanes or other aircraft that are joining. Again, we talk more about this in later lessons. Larger aircraft have priority. Now, we talked about this before, and you've seen on several of our landings so far, we've had to give way to Air New Zealand, extend our downwind leg, or do some turns to allow positioning. This is quite common in busy airports like this. And we'll talk more about this in the next circuits lesson as well. We always want to make sure we follow at a safe distance, not overtaking or cutting in front of other aeroplanes, particularly those that are in front of us. So a large part of this lesson is awareness. You need to be listening to all the radio calls that are made, make radio calls yourself, and when you do hear someone else talking, to assess whether or not they are a conflict, and if they are, to do something about it. as I mentioned before, circuits are given a particular direction. We always make turns in the direction of the published circuit direction. Again, we'll talk about this at the end of the briefing, where I'll introduce to you in the AIP how to determine what direction the circuit is. Our discussions today, though, will be based on the standard left-handed circuit. The circuit altitude should be flown accurately, so whatever altitude that we're required to level off at downwind is the altitude that we should maintain. This is important for a number of reasons. Airspace containment. Sometimes we are very close to the boundary of airspace. Also, traffic separation is really important. And even being able to sight aircraft. If everyone is at the same level in the circuit, you will be able to be confident that you should be able to look straight ahead and see them in front of you. You don't have to look up, you don't have to look down. They should all be on the same path as you. So these are just some of the giveaway rules that we have to be aware of. So let's start now building the circuit, the things that we would be doing for this lesson today. And we're going to start with pre-takeoff. So as you know, before we actually take off, we do a series of checks, run-up checks and pre-takeoff checks. Do you remember what all of those are for? You know, and see what they say there. What are run-up checks for? Question for you guys.
Verify the engine's running properly.
Yeah. The engine and associated systems are operating normally. We'd rather know on the ground if there was something wrong, wouldn't we? We don't want to find out in the air. Pre-takeoff checks, what are they for? Question for you guys.
Making sure we configure for tables.
Yeah.
That what equals what.
Correct. Nice, simple, one sentence, that's all you need to say. Otherwise, ask them, okay, get them involved, because you have done this stuff with them prior to now. If you think about it, we normally introduce students to these checks, or at least some of them, in the taxi briefing, so that's way back. So we've done our checks, we're now ready to depart. We've talked to the tower, we've told them we're ready, and they've said that we can line up on the runway. So we're now going to taxi out to the runway. This should be revision based, okay? There may be times where you haven't introduced the takeoff to students yet, but it's really just formalising the considerations in this briefing. Before we enter the runway, it's really important to make sure A, that we've been cleared if it is a controlled aerodrome, and B, that the runway is clear of any other aeroplanes taking off or landing. But also, we must check the approach path. We need to scan up and down the extended centre line in the distance to check that there are no aeroplanes. Not only that, but we've got to think about how long it's going to take us to actually line up and to take off. Will there be enough time for us to depart safely before that Air New Zealand ATR is actually touching down on the runway? Remember, they travel a lot faster than us. Do mention about scanning up and down the centre line, because particularly if 2.5's in use, you know, there's been several times where I've been told to hold at Bravo 1 there, because there's traffic on final. Where is it? But they get disguised against the background of the ranges, because of course you're not seeing them against the sky, they're blending in, and so you're looking up and down, you can't see anything, but if you're not looking low enough, you won't see them. Not such a problem for 07, because you do have just sky in the background, but it's really important to do that. Emphasise that. Ideally, we would use the maximum runway distance available, and this is something we'll talk more about in the emergency briefings for circuits in the future. But it's within reason. Here in Palmerston North, as you've seen, we tend to take off from beam Bravo 1. There's only approximately 100 metres of runway behind us, so it's acceptable for us to take off from there. And when runway 07's in use, we usually take off from beam Delta. But we still have, what is it? How much runway is in front of us from Delta? Is it 1,000? Or is it? It must be about 1,000, because it's about 800 or 900 back that way. So it's got to be about 1,000 the other way, you know. So there's a sufficient distance for us to take off, and we've assessed that in our SOPs, our standard operating procedures. If it's a short runway though, shorter runway, it always pays to backtrack full length. So if we're using the grass runway, we always make sure we commence our takeoff roll from the very beginning of that runway. And some of the other aerodromes we use around here, such as Dannevirke, Fielding and Foxpine, we always make sure we take off from the full length as well, because they're all shorter. Do you know why we don't backtrack aside from what I just said that we have assessed it as sufficient distance?
Saves time.
Saves time, anything else? How long would it take to backtrack all the way down to the threshold of 0.7? The likelihood would be that we're going to cause someone to go around and be told to orbit or extend our wind, so we don't also want to unaware them when we know we do have a sufficient safe distance to take off. So you can talk about those things if you want. So we're lining up on the runway now. The runway's all clear. We want to make sure we come to a stop with the nose wheel straight. So bring the power back to idle, come to a stop using brakes if necessary with the nose wheel straight on the centre line, and then we will do our line-up checks. Do you remember what those are? And they should remember them. What are the line-up checks? Strobe we should mention that back there, that the strobe should be turned on prior to entering the runway. That's an SOP. Yep, what else? Once you've been given your clearance.
Fuel pump.
Yep, anything else?
IFR, heater heat,
Anything else?
and then Aegis combined.
Anything else? Anything that might be useful?
Please confirm looking at
Sorry?
just confirm looking at your mixtures or
I can't hear you, sorry.
just confirm looking at like mixtures.
No, that's pre-takeoff. That should have been done back there. I get annoyed when I see students doing that because it tells me they haven't done their pre-takeoffs properly.
A clearance?
Sorry?
Waiting for a clearance?
Yep. Windsock is a good one to check as well. It might not be in the SOP. You should also check it just before you do your performance briefing because the students always say, oh yes, we have normal takeoff and blah, 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 and it's not. You look at the windsock and there's a 10 knot crosswind. Why does that happen? Because sometimes the ATIS isn't updated regularly enough, but that shouldn't be the problem. They should be well aware of the conditions. So check the windsock before you do your performance briefing. Check it again in the lineup to make sure that it's still the appropriate runway. And you're actually aware of what the conditions are doing. So add that into that. I do the same thing as part of the landing checks as well. So if the student was only relying on what they briefed on in their TC2 and they say it's a normal landing and there's actually a 10 knot crosswind, the chances are they're going to land sideways. So if they check the windsock as part of the landing checks, then that's less likely to actually happen. So why I expand on that is we want to set good habits now. Okay, we don't want bad habits to creep in. Because it's a pet peeve of examiners when they ask students, or just show me a normal landing, and by normal the student thinks that that is just without any crosswind allowance. No, if there's crosswind, the student should always be actually allowing for that. KDP1. So this is a way to confirm that we are happy to take off. So we only do this as the very last item of the lineup checks. We check the windsock, we've been given our clearance. KDP1, we are happy to go. And now we're ready for takeoff. So a slight tangent. Let's talk about flap on the takeoff, why we actually use it. Can you think back to some of the earlier briefings and tell me why is it that we use flap for takeoff? They probably remember this, but if not, you're going to have to guide them through it. So you might have to fill in a few blanks. Lead into this second bit, so they'll say, oh yep, increase lift, get off the ground sooner, that's great. But are there any drawbacks? Yes, that drag means poorer obstacle clearance, poorer rate of climb. Then your next slide brings this stuff up here. So it just is an illustration of the benefits there and the disadvantages. There's our takeoff. What's it saying? Without flap, we've used a certain distance to get airborne. We're climbing at a certain angle. We've got a certain rate of climb. But what if we set takeoff flap? We get airborne much sooner, and even though we're climbing at a shallower angle initially, because we're airborne sooner, we're more likely to clear obstacles, but our rate of climb is reduced. And this is why we raise the flap fairly early on at only a couple of 100 feet above the ground after we've taken off. We want the aeroplane to have an improved angle of climb. So running through that. So now the takeoff roll. We've been given our clearance, we are ready to take off. It's helpful to pick a reference point on the extended centre line. That might just be a tree down the end. That may seem stupid when you've got a painted centre line, and it is stupid when there's a painted centre line, but when you go to grass runways course, you don't have a centre line, do you? So what will the student use as their reference to know they're on the centre line? Ideally, some sort of feature down here. It also pays to pick a feature above the runway in the distance so that when we're airborne, we can track towards that and stay on the extended centre line. Ready for takeoff, we're going to set full power. So you've already done this before, so just to highlight some of the formalities, we're going to set full power over 3 to 4 seconds. Keep straight as we do that because the aeroplane's going to want to yaw. And as we accelerate down the runway, a brief look inside to make sure that the airspeed is actually showing that we're accelerating, and then eyes outside, and they should remain outside for most of the rest of the takeoff. As we accelerate down the runway, maintain a little bit of back pressure on the stick. We're not trying to get the aeroplane airborne too early, but just to take a little bit of the weight off the nose wheel, and I'll show you what that looks like and feels like today. Once we get to, no, we're not there yet, talk about that yaw now. Do you remember what slipstream was? So lead into the next slide with some questions around slipstream. Full power, what's the aeroplane going to do? Oh, it's going to yaw to the left. So how will you keep us on the centre line? Oh, well, we will use the rudder. And one other thing that we haven't talked about so far that also causes yaw during the takeoff roll is torque reaction. So the engine rotates in a clockwise direction, and there is an equal opposite reaction to that, called torque reaction, which puts force or friction on the left-hand wheel, and also makes the aeroplane yaw to the left. When you were a kid, you might have had a toy that had a propeller on it, and you grabbed the propeller and then were fascinated that the toy started spinning in the opposite direction to the propeller. That is torque reaction. If we were to somehow be able to grab the propeller on a DA-40, it would want to rotate in the opposite direction than the propeller. So both of these things cause yaw during the takeoff roll, and you've been doing a pretty good job so far of keeping us on the centre line. So keep that up. Don't talk about crosswind here. This should just be revision based, right? So if they've already told you, oh yeah, I need to use rudder, then you don't have to go through this word for word, but really this slide could be used as an opportunity to highlight to your student, keep your feet off and away from the brakes during the takeoff roll. When they are ready to set full power, their toes should be on the rudder bars and nowhere near the brake pads. We don't want to accidentally touch those during the takeoff roll. And you often see students quite guilty of that, so really highlight there, just some housekeeping stuff. So we've accelerated down the runway, we're at our rotate speed now of 60 knots, so we're eyes inside every now and again to just check that we're getting to that speed. 60 knots, we can smoothly ease back on the stick to get the aeroplane airborne, and we'll set the climb attitude, the best rate for flat, and allow the aeroplane to accelerate to 80 knots. Once we've lifted off, make sure we continue to fly straight, so keep the wings level and prevent yaw with rudder. Once we're airborne, we're established at 80 knots. We have to think about our after takeoff checks. Just a few points to highlight at this moment. We will raise the flap somewhere before 500 feet AGL. Now, you've been doing this on several of the flights up to now. Remember, there's a few things that we check before we raise flap, so ask those questions. Oh yeah, positive rate of climb. Safe speed, so 80 knots is what our target speed should be. And you don't need to talk about the one stage of flap at a time because we should only have one stage of flap. Passing 500 feet AGL, we can then lower the nose to the cruise climb attitude for 90 knots. And we can complete our after takeoff checks, or what is left of them. Make sure the fuel pump has been turned off above 500 feet AGL, the flap is up, and the transponder is in alt mode, landing light stays on for VFR flights. So here's a bit of a diagram to just highlight some of those things. There we are at 60 knots, we rotate, accelerate to 80 knots, setting the climb attitude, raising the flap before 500 feet AGL, then set the cruise climb attitude for 90 knots, and doing our the remainder of our after takeoff checks. And this brings us to the crosswind leg. So by now we should be getting pretty close to 500 feet AGL, and it's time to think about turning onto the crosswind leg. This would ideally be done at 500 feet AGL. Before we turn, we must do a thorough lookout. And I don't want you to rush, because remember, circuits concentrate traffic. We need to make sure we do a thorough lookout so that we don't create conflicts with anyone else. I always say start the lookout about 100 to 150 feet before your turning altitude, and by the time you've done that thorough lookout, you'll be at 500 feet AGL. Then we're going to do a climbing turn onto the crosswind leg, onto our reference point, and we need to allow for drift. It's rare that we'll get a perfectly calm day, so we need to make sure we track a rectangular crosswind leg by positioning the nose of the aeroplane into wind so that we can do that. And then this brings you to the video, basically just to summarize everything we've talked about so far. So how does it play? I think this clip, does it? There we go. There is volume, I don't know why it's not working there. Never mind. So we've done our lineup checks, KDP1, we're happy to go. Picked our reference points, setting full power over 3 to 4 seconds, keeping straight on the center line. Checking the airspeed is accelerating, then eyes back outside. Waiting for the airspeed to get to 60 knots, then rotating, smoothly ease back on the stick to set the climb attitude for best rate of flap, allow the aeroplane to accelerate to 80 knots. This will take a little while. Maintain the extended center line by keeping the wings level, preventing yaw with rudder. It's important we continue to hold that rudder in. Safe speed, safe height, positive rate of climb. We'll raise the takeoff flap somewhere around here. And then we'll need to pitch the nose up to continue climbing at 80 knots. We always climb at 80 knots until 500 feet AGL. Starting that lookout now, we've got about 100, 150 feet to go until we're at our crosswind leg. Thorough lookout, picking a reference point, and then we're going to start our turn onto the crosswind leg. And we've lowered the nose to the attitude for cruise climb. And we do the rest of our after takeoff checks. So that's the first part of the circuit. Hey, notice there that we turned right, and what did I say a standard circuit was? Left hand. So just to make you aware at this stage, some circuits are right hand, some are non-standard, which we will talk more about next time. So we're now established on the crosswind leg, tracking towards our reference point, allowing for drift. Usually it's on the crosswind leg that our aeroplanes reach the circuit altitude, in this case at Palmerston North of 1,100 feet. So most oftentimes we are levelling off along the crosswind leg here somewhere. So do you remember what the process for levelling off from a climb was? Oh yeah, it's attitude power trim, great. So you remember that, that's good. Sometimes we level off in the downwind leg. This depends on conditions and a number of other factors which we'll learn about as you go through this circuit training. We turn downwind onto the next leg when the aeroplane is at a 45-degree angle from the upwind threshold. There's a couple of slides to show you what that looks like coming up. We want to make sure we're turning downwind there at that same angle every single time. And the idea behind this is that every aeroplane in the downwind leg will be following the same line. I usually draw a little bit of a diagram up at this point, so just to really highlight why we want to turn downwind at that point. There's that 45-degree angle there, so we want to be turning downwind there so that we have this correct spacing, but also if every aeroplane does that, we're not having to look out here for the aeroplane that didn't turn at that angle. We're also not having to look over here for an aeroplane that also didn't, backtrack a little bit. We're also not having to look over here for aeroplanes that turned at a different angle. Everyone on the same line means that looking out for them will be easier. We can just look straight ahead of us. Does that make sense? That's the idea, one of the reasons behind it. Once we're established on the downwind leg, we want to make sure the aeroplane is tracking parallel to the runway. We want this consistent spacing downwind. We don't want to be getting closer to the runway, potentially posing a conflict to other traffic, and we also don't want to drift further away for a variety of reasons as well. So we pick a reference point, assess the wind, and we keep tracking in a straight line parallel with the runway. I mentioned that there are a few slides to show what that angle should look like. Here is an aeroplane, DA40, just starting its turn to the downwind leg for a takeoff on runway 07. So take note of that angle there. It's approximately 45 degrees from the upwind threshold of the aeroplane. This is about what the picture should look like. This is an example of an aeroplane that's just taken off from runway 25 and has made a right-hand turn onto the crosswind leg and is about to make a right-hand turn downwind, noting the 45-degree angle from the upwind threshold in the aeroplane. This is what the picture should look like. Here's a picture of the aeroplane established in the downwind leg. So the pilot is leveled off at the circuit altitude into straight level flight. We've picked a reference point and we're tracking the aeroplane straight towards it, not diverging away from the runway, not converging on it. This is important for traffic conflicts, but also, as you'll learn in future lessons, if there was to be an engine failure in the circuit, we need to be confident of being able to glide back to the runway. What would be the point of landing in a paddock when we have a 2,000-metre runway to land on? So there are many considerations of why a correct and consistent spacing is important. An easy way for you to judge the correct spacing in a DA40 from your seat is where the runway intersects the wing. For a left-hand circuit like this, that spacing should be ideally having the runway cutting through about a third of the way from the wingtip there. This is one way we'll know we have the correct spacing. Now that changes for a right-hand circuit, which we'll talk about next time. Another method you can use is judge the angle between the aeroplane and the runway. So if you look at the runway now, you can see everything, you're looking down and across to the runway. But if we go to our next slide, here we go. Have a look at the angle now. So you see looking down onto the runway is more of a steep angle. We're not looking so much across, we're more looking down onto it. And this is telling us we are too close. Perhaps we turned too quickly downwind on the crosswind leg. You can also see that the runway is now intersecting through the wing about a third of the way from the wing root this time, both telling us we have turned too soon downwind. A couple of problems here, traffic conflicts, but also being so close to the runway means our base leg will be a much shorter distance. And this could lead to us getting high on our approach to landing. Not ideal. Here's the opposite. So this time, let's say we turn downwind a little bit later. Note how the angle between the aircraft and the runway is a lot shallower. You're now looking much more across at the runway. Shallower angle, much wider downwind. Probably won't be able to reach the runway if the engine failed. Possible traffic separation problems. We might have someone cutting in between us and the runway. And this time the base leg will be really long, leading to excess altitude being lost and we might get low. So again, lots of reasons why we want consistent and correct spacing. Have a look at that distance there between the, from where the runway intersects through the wing. It's very close to the wingtip. So These are all cues you can use to judge the correct spacing. I mentioned that the downwind leg is the longest in terms of the distance, but there's a lot to do, so don't delay. Get on to the actions that are required in a downwind leg fairly promptly. We want to make sure that we continue to track parallel, so our eyes should mostly be outside, assessing that we're not converging or diverging on the runway, that we're tracking towards our reference point, assessing the spacing, and making sure we're maintaining altitude correctly. So we should have already established the aeroplane into straight and level flight and trimmed accurately. A radio call is going to be required to the tower or to local traffic to tell them what we're doing. We're also going to need to do the pre-landing checks, and we're going to need to brief the approach. And we'll talk more specifically about that shortly. The wind is often very different at circuit altitude compared to on the ground. So we have to be aware of this. We have to assess what the wind is doing and if there is any drift so that we can track parallel to the runway. So imagine here we've leveled off, we're in the 07 circuit and we have a wind coming from that blue vector there. This orange dotted line represents the path the aeroplane will follow if we don't make any allowances for the wind. So we're going to converge on the runway, possibly create a conflict with some traffic, and also the distance of the basic is reduced, so we might get high. So we need to turn the aeroplane's nose into wind in order to keep tracking along that yellow dotted line. What about if the wind was coming from the south here? So the new orange dotted line represents the path the aeroplane may follow. We're going to diverge away from the runway, won't be able to glide to it if we have any emergencies, and potentially create conflicts and get too low on our approach. So we need to position the aeroplane's nose into wind like that to track towards our reference point to maintain the spacing. Now you've been doing some of these radio calls already, so what would you say to the tower if we were downwind and we wanted to land? So ask your students that. There's a slight difference in how we'd say these things if it was an uncontrolled aerodrome versus a controlled aerodrome. Keep the radio call standard. As you know, the CAA's got a big roadshow thing on at the moment about radio procedures, and we're wanting to get rid of any unnecessary words, okay? So only say what is necessary. So an example might be fielding traffic, Massey 28, downwind, runway 28, full stop. That's it. Not number one if we're the only aircraft there. There's no need to say that. We don't need to say for the sealed runway, because there is only one published vector at fielding. Always think about what we want to say before we say it. At a controlled aerodrome, Massey 28, downwind, runway 25, request full stop, or touch and go, whichever one applies to us. Honestly, you could even get rid of the request. I can't remember what the CAA's opinion of that was, but when we say something like that to the tower know it is a request. So do we even need to say request? Probably not, eh? I don't bother saying it myself. We also need to do the pre-landing checks. Do you remember what those are? Yep, they should remember what those are, so a bit of revision here, right? What I also like to tell them here is once they've tested the brakes, feet removed well clear of them. So heels to the floor, toes just back on the rudder bar, because I've had several students who've landed with their feet still on the brakes. Not good. Had a popped tyre once and that was not fun. In fielding of all places. Narrowest runway around. And briefing the approach. So there's lots to do downwind, and you're not going to have a lot of time to do it. So this is where you can give an example of that. Is there an example later on? I don't think so. But what I say is this will be a normal approach for runway 25. The aiming point, the 300 meter markers, KDP 5 is at 450 feet, and the threshold crossing speed is 70 knots. So you're nominating the type of approach and landing you're doing, and the rest of that data is fairly standard. So add that in there. Make sure you do that. for our runway, for the sealed runway I should say, we use the 300 metre markers as our aiming point, but on shorter runways we don't. B, make sure you do really talk to your students about this, not necessarily here, but later on when you're using different aerodromes, because it used to scare the crap out of me and everyone at Hawera Aero Club when we'd see Massey students come to the aerodrome and land 300 or 400 metres into a runway that is only 700 metres long and still try to do a touch and go. We were so sure sometimes that aeroplanes were going to go through the fence. And why is this happening? I know for a variety of reasons. One is that the students get so used to landing on a 2,000 metre runway and, oh, who cares if we float another 200 metres, we've still got 1,500 metres in front of us, what does it matter? Well, on a short runway it definitely does. And as you know, DA40s like to float, right? And get away with it in little Cessnas that just fall out of the sky as soon as you bring the power back, but DA40s park right. So really emphasise that decision making when you do fly to other aerodromes, that aiming point needs to be close to the threshold, and the decision making around going around if they're not going to touch down there. A rule of thumb I used to have is if you're not on the ground, aside from like a short field takeoff or landing, if you're not on the ground in the first third of the runway, then go around. If you haven't had full power set by halfway down, then don't set full power, just do a full stop landing. You can always backtrack, you know. Not always is there going to be a lot of room behind you. Probably around here on the downwind stage, I would say have a bit of a break because we've been going for 40 minutes, talking about a few tangents here, but you know, you've probably been going for 35 to 40 minutes by now. So have a bit of a break, allow them 5 or 10 minutes, and then move on. So it's around here that we need to think about turning onto the base leg. Setting up for the base leg really begins downwind, and there's a lot of things that we have to think about, such as these: when to reduce the power to start slowing down, how much to reduce the power to, when to actually start our turn onto the base leg, and when to lower flat. These are all things that will change potentially from one circuit to the next. So I will talk to you in today's lesson about the ideal or the standard circuit, but thereafter you'll find this will change. There are a lot of things you have to think about. Here are some of them. Over the course of your circuit training, we will talk about all of these. Any that are relevant in today's lesson, we'll discuss. Most of these we'll talk about in the next briefing, circuit considerations. The wind is a big one. We've already talked about that today, but must always be aware of where it's coming from, assessing how strong it is so that you can anticipate its effects. So have a bit of a read of those. Just to give you an idea, there are lots of things affecting when we return onto the base leg. So there's no need to go through all of these at this stage. In an ideal circuit, we would normally turn onto the base leg when we're at a 45-degree angle from the landing threshold. Just prior to that, we've usually started reducing the power. With a new student or a low-time student, like, you can get away with reducing the power as you start to pass the threshold, but as they get a lot more efficient with things, you might actually find reducing the power there is too soon, because all of a sudden they're trimmed at 80 knots, flap is set, ready to turn, but it's going to be way too soon. So just be aware there that as they get a lot more practice at it, you may say to them, so just start delaying your setup a little bit now. We ideally still want to turn at that 45-degree angle. Set flat when we're below VFE. Some of this stuff should just be revision, okay, so I'll skip over it. You could ask them about maintaining level as they start to slow down. We've introduced that in descending before. Once the aeroplane is set up with flap and we're trimmed, thorough look out, pick a reference point to turn onto, and then we can turn onto the base leg. So the aeroplane will be established at 80 knots. 500 feet per minute is not a target, but for the typical power setting we use and for 80 knots, the rate of descent is usually around 500 feet per minute. So if you see the vertical speed indicator indicating 1,000 or 100 feet per minute, something is wrong. Maybe the power setting on the nose attitude is incorrect. So scan and make sure we're trimmed. As we've discussed on all of the other legs, we want to make sure we're tracking towards the reference point, allowing for drift. We use the attitude to maintain 80 knots. And we're going to use runway perspective to judge height. So I mentioned before that an easy, or probably the best way to judge your profile and your height on the base leg is to think of the angle between the aeroplane and the aiming point. So we'll discuss that in a couple of slides' time. Ideally, for a standard circuit, we'd aim to be established on final between 5 and 600 feet AGL. So we're going to use power to control the rate of descent and the angle of descent to achieve that. We want a tidy turn onto the extended centerline. We don't want to blast through it. So you could draw up a little diagram if you wanted to about that, but just you're going to introduce them to it in the fight about anticipating the turn. Don't start turning when we're on the centerline. We'll need to start turning slightly before that. Looking out is really important. We're about to turn on to the final leg. We need to scan the extended centerline to make sure we're not going to cut in front of anyone. Then we can turn on to final. So here we are on a left base for runway 25. Have a look at that angle between the aircraft and the aiming point, the 300 metre markers just there where I've got the laser. There's a certain angle being formed. This is what it looks like to be on profile. This is how the angle changes if we start to get high. So take a look at that angle again between the aiming point and the aircraft. Notice how it's a lot steeper this time. Now we're looking more down onto the aiming point as opposed to across at it. Angle is steeper, we're getting high. What can we do about this? Reduce the power to get back down onto profile. Take a look at this one. So this time, note the angle between us and the aiming point is a lot shallower. We're looking much more across at the runway. Things are really rising up in our peripheral vision. Shallow angle, getting low. What do we need to do? Add some power to get back onto profile, to reduce the rate of descent. So that brings us to the final leg. Once we're established onto final, we will reduce the speed to 75 knots by pitching the nose up slightly and re-trimming. And we'll complete the landing checks. Do you remember what those are? So you could just ask them that, revision of that. I think it comes up in the next slide as well. Once we're established on final, there's a bit of an activity cycle that you want to keep talking through in your head. So speed, centerline, and profile. Are we on the correct speed? Making adjustments to the nose attitude and to trim if required. Are we on profile? Make adjustments with the throttle as required. And are we on centerline? Ideally, we're maintaining the centerline, so keep the wings level and prevent yaw with rudder, or make corrections if we need to. We're descending down towards the runway. We're going to arrive at our 450 feet, our KDP 5 altitude. So we'll assess those things again. Are we on speed, centerline, and profile? And if we are, we'll continue with the approach. Here are those final checks, so I'm going to skip through those because you can use this as revision and I've just answered your question. Probably the one to mention is your VREF speed. Ideally, you're stabilised at that by the time you do KDP 5, not when you actually get to the threshold. A little bit earlier than that. And that's when your 70 knots comes in. We've talked a little bit about this before, so you could just use this as revision as you wanted, but really highlighting that it's the attitude that controls your speed and it's the power that controls the rate of descent. So you're using the power to ensure that you're going to touch down at the 300 metre markers and adjust the nose attitude to make sure that you actually maintain your speed. whenever you make changes to the attitude, to the speed, big power changes, flap changes, the aeroplane needs to be retrimmed. Emphasise that to them because I find they often stop trimming the aeroplane, usually on final there somewhere, and then they're fighting the aeroplane all the way down the approach, and that just makes it all unstable. We've talked a few different ways about judging profile already, particularly for base legs, so that angle is really useful, but once you're on final, you could also use the runway perspective, which is illustrated in this diagram here. So an example of what the runway should look like is in the middle diagram. This is for an aeroplane that is on profile. If we get below profile, the diagram on the left shows that the runway appears to get shorter and may appear to get wider. This tells you are too low. If you're getting above profile, the diagram on the right-hand side shows there that the runway appears to get longer and it may also appear to get narrower. I find that unless you're ridiculously high or ridiculously low, this is not a great way on its own to judge if the aeroplane is maintaining profile. And like I said earlier, sometimes you've got the illusions if you go to a runway that actually is skinnier, like fielding, throws it all out. So I don't tell them to ignore this, but on its own, not so valuable, only useful for the extremes. So another method we have is to assess where the aiming point sits in the wind stream, and also to use the PAPI lights if the aerodrome has them. So let's discuss those now. This is where the aiming point may sit if we're on profile. It may look different for you, depending on how high you sat in your seat, but here it's about a third of the way up the wind stream. So let's say this represents the aeroplane being on profile. So as we fly down towards the aiming point there, we want to keep the aiming point in a fixed point in the wind stream. So let's have a look at what it might mean if the aiming point starts to move down the wind stream and disappear below the nose. Worst case, it's going to start disappearing. This is an indicator that the aeroplane is getting high above profile. So what would we do? Ask them the question, because you've told them several times now how to control the rate of descent. Oh, we reduce the power. Hopefully they say that. What about the opposite? Another click brings that up. If we start to notice the aiming points moving up the wind stream, this can be an indication that the aeroplane is getting low, below profile. So what would we do? Add some power. And the last method is the approach lights. You may have talked to them about these before, but just run through these. Oops. Talk about the different light indications, what they mean. In our SOPs, I'm pretty sure it gives you some guidance around what's acceptable. I'm sure it says 3 reds is also okay, because we're in a smaller aeroplane. Does anyone remember those SOPs? I'm sure there's something in there about 3 reds is okay by day VFR.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. This slide here is to introduce the idea that or to recap on the idea that they're controlling airspeed with attitude, rate of descent with power, but often when they're adjusting one of those, they'll have to coordinate and adjust the other one at the same time. So this is where you can start introducing this idea. So here we are on our approach to land on runway 07. The red dashed line represents our rather steep looking profile down to the runway that we should be maintaining, let's say. This blue dotted line actually represents the flight path flown by the aeroplane. So what's happening here? Well, let's say you've noticed the aiming point is moving down the wind stream. You've noticed the angle between you and the aiming point has got steeper. So you've realised you're high. So what will you do? Hopefully they'll tell you, oh, reduce the power. But we'll also need to lower the nose to maintain the correct speed. So let's say we do that. The aeroplane starts descending at a faster rate, same speed, and look, now we've actually come right down through the profile, and we're getting low. So you've looked back at your aiming point. The aiming point's now moved up the wind stream. The angle's getting shallower between the aiming point and the aircraft. You've now realised you're low, so what would you do? see if they remember, increase the power, and you'll have to raise the nose at the same time to maintain the speed. So what we'd ideally do is once we've actually recaptured the profile, brought the aeroplane back onto profile, another adjustment to power and nose attitude will be required to maintain it. Hey, and don't forget to trim. Now we're back on profile, hopefully the remainder of the approach will be stable. That brings us to the last part of the briefing, which is the new part for you, which is the landing. The landing really consists of 4 individual phases. Phase 1 is the flare, or the round out and level off. Then there's the hold off, the touchdown, and the landing roll or roll out. So let's discuss those in a little bit more detail. Firstly, the flare. So we're on our descent down towards the aiming point. We're noticing now that the aiming point is starting to rise up to meet the aircraft. And I'll show you today what that actually looks like, when exactly you should start the round out, what the runway should look like in your peripheral vision, because we don't want to be looking inside to start this procedure. It's definitely an eyes outside maneuver. When we notice the aiming point's rushing up to meet us, we'll close the throttle and transition from a descent attitude to start leveling the aeroplane off to reduce the rate of descent. So here's a picture. Approaching our runway, 300 meter markers is our aiming point. The aeroplane's coming down to the aiming point now. It's rising up to meet us. We're going to close the throttle, close the throttle and start raising the nose to level off with the runway. Then there's the hold off. So once we've completed the flare, we will gradually start increasing the back pressure to set the landing attitude. We don't want to start flying away from the runway though, so increase the back pressure too quickly and we will start to climb. So I will demonstrate to you today how quickly that back pressure is increased. Whilst we do that, we want our eyes towards the end of the runway. This is what it looks like, setting the landing attitude. And then we will touch down on the main gear with a slightly high nose attitude, and then gently lower the nose wheel, and then the landing run. So we'll decide whether or not, we'll already know whether we're doing a touch and go or a full stop landing. If it's disregard, we will keep straight on the runway with rudder, and if we're doing a touch and go, we'll discuss that more next time. Or if we're doing a full stop landing, we will use brakes as required to slow down and vacate the runway at one of the...
If I could just add something to that,
Sure.
if you don't mind.
Just here.
Yeah, so the hold off, you can also talk about the lift formula if you really want to. So we've leveled off just above the runway. So now the throttle's closed, we're going to slow down. So as the aircraft's slowing down, it's going to reduce lift, and we're going to raise the nose to maintain the same amount of lift until we reach that altitude. Otherwise, if we just fly it on, we can have too much energy and we can end up bouncing and that sort of stuff. So we'll talk about the lift formula there until we hit the landing attitude, and then you just let it sink. Using straight rudder at the right end, you can talk about which rudder. So as you close the throttle, what did we learn about that for fixed controls, or what happened to the nose? When you close the throttle, reduce the power, which way does the nose go?
The right.
Goes right, very handy. Okay, so you might need to, if you're using left rudder, a right rudder with power, you might want to reduce it. That always gets people caught out, and especially in crosswinds, they don't account for the power change as well. We end up looking really good, and then the last second we crook it and rattling around the canopy.
You might find you spend a bit of time actually showing them what the landing attitude looks like. Some people I see sit them in the aeroplane on the apron and then go to push on the tail to actually show them, look, this is what it might look like. It's up to you if you do that. I'm not bothered myself, but perhaps it's useful for some students. But I always really emphasise it when you're actually in the aeroplane. Spend a bit of time on one of the landings, just describing what that picture actually looks like, as opposed to the technique of the landing. But that's what we call the cues. So this last slide is just a summary of what you've talked about. So recap on everything. I'm not going to present it to you because it's all just stuff we've talked about already. The 4 phases again. Aircraft management, this should just be revision based, so you can ask them some questions around the speeds for the flaps. To emphasise with checks, like I don't want to see a student looking down at a piece of paper that is the checklist when they're on the runway. We need to be eyes outside, so what I expect the students to do is memorise the line-up checks, the after takeoff checks, and the pre-landing checks, and the landing checks themselves, because they're all done at critical phases where you're either slow or low, or a combination of those things, and you do not want them getting distracted looking at a bit of paper. They need to be looking outside and managing the aeroplane, flying the aeroplane. Fortunately, by this stage, they probably have memorised those, but that would be homework for them. If they hadn't done that, tell them to please memorise these before we actually do this flight. It's not just about efficiency, it's about safety as well. Things to emphasise here is this actually is a fairly stressful lesson for a student, because even though they've learned all of this stuff before, it's condensed into a 6-minute circuit, so it's busy. And as I indicated earlier, they take too long to do things. So they get behind the aeroplane and then they start panicking. Emphasise these things under situational awareness. We've talked a lot about lookout already, but what I would say here is the student will get behind the aeroplane and they'll realise, oh, I'm not turning onto basing at 45 degrees, we're way too far downwind. And so what's the first thing they sacrifice? It's the lookout, because they think turning onto the base leg at that correct angle was the most important thing. No, look, we extend downwind a little bit, we're not going to fall out of the sky, but we should always do a lookout, thorough. So be really disciplined, ensure that they are disciplined with that, pull them up on it, and discuss that if you do see this happening. The listening out, we've talked about that already, but always listening to what is being said on the radio. We're wanting to develop a mental picture of what everyone is doing, where they are there any conflicts, what are we going to do about it? Some of the radio calls they will have already been doing probably by this stage. I used to, when I was teaching part 1, create a little sheet of the standard radio calls, and I printed it out for them just so they can take it home and memorise them. But there's other resources, like there's the GAP booklet on radio calls, there's an AC for the radio telephone manual, there's the Waypoints book. Give them some things to take away and practice. Emphasise this. I see this happening a lot as well. Hand should always be on the throttle below 1,000 feet unless it's performing some other task like setting a flap or trimming, whatever else may need to be done. And this really just summarises what I've said several times now. It does get easier though. Really reassure them of that, and reassure them in the post-flight debrief as well, because they're probably completely fried, completely frazzled. Maybe the flight, in their opinion, didn't go so well, but reassure them that it does get easier the more they practice this. That's all it is, practice, practice, practice. So like I said, the circuit considerations briefing would be an ideal one to also complete before they do this lesson, because inevitably there will be things that crop up, like you'll get told to orbit or extend downwind or go around, something that is relevant to that briefing, even in your circuit intro. You'll have to think about the conditions of the day that you do this. You don't want crosswind, you don't want it to be really strong wind, so you really consider the wind before you actually go fly this lesson. We'll talk more about that when you actually do this lesson with your instructor. Do you have any questions about any of that stuff? So I think that was about an hour and 10 minutes, maybe a bit longer with some of the